Hello, everyone. This is a video that's long overdue. This was from an event that I put on with Centro Cuatlicue with MEChA at UCLA, I think like 2 quarters ago, which I know that some of the folks who follow me on Instagram attended, and other folks asked if we were going to have a recording so that they could watch it later. Unfortunately, we didn't record that night just because it was a conversation more than anything, and we didn't want anybody to feel uncomfortable or unsafe with sharing their experiences. So I will share with you all now this video of kind of essentially what I spoke about at that event. And I apologize in advance because this format of the slides and this presentation was more so, like I said, to have a conversation, to facilitate a conversation between people that were in this space. It wasn't really just made for me to sit here and talk, but I will do my best. So this is called Macho Toxico, Misogyny, Culture, and How We Deal. And this is a conversation on misogyny, or machismo as it is known in Spanish. And I will be talking about my experiences because I'm the only one here. And my experiences have to do with coming from a Mexican background and a Mexican family. And disclaimer that I always do, this is not to be Mexican centric. It is because I don't really like to use umbrella terms like Latine. You know, I could be up here saying like, oh, we're going to talk about machismo in Latine communities, but I'm Mexican and that's what I know and that's what I've experienced. And I don't want to speak for or over other people. I just don't want to homogenize all Latina communities because the United States already does that so well for us. So I just don't want to perpetuate that. Okay, so just getting right into it. Again, these are slides that I made because this was going to be a space with a lot of different people. But can we take a moment to appreciate how pretty this is? You wouldn't know that I made these slides at 2 a.m. the night before the presentation or the event. So what is machismo? What does it look like, sound like, feel like to you? Again, this was supposed to be kind of like an opener where the panelists, we would talk about it and then we would open it for other people in the Zoom meeting to talk about. But I think that I can take the time here to kind of define some of these words or define some terms like machismo, which is misogyny in English, or at least that's how I interchangeably use it. So misogyny or machismo comes from patriarchy or patriarchal ideology, which essentially just means that the patriarchy is this ideology where being a cisgender heterosexual man is the standard and everyone must live up to the standards or the rules that cisgender heterosexual men impose. In this situation, I guess for a lot of us living, especially in the United States, it has to do more with a patriarchal ideology, with machismo stemming from cisgender heterosexual white male ideologies of what we should all be doing, right? These expectations that we all have. So machismo, at least for me, can look like, sound like, feel like a lot of different things. And but before that, let me define cisgender and some of these other terms that some people might not be familiar with. So cisgender basically means that if you are cisgender, you identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. So, for example, I am a cisgender woman, which means that I was assigned female at birth, and that's what I use. And heterosexual just means that I guess you're straight, that you are attracted to or sexually or romantically attracted to only to the opposite gender, I guess. And I think that I'm going to use the word heteronormative as well, too. So just to kind of identify that word now, heteronormative basically means like we live in a heteronormative society, which makes like heterosexuality normal. And by that, I mean like, for instance, when we look and see two people of the opposite sex or who seem to be from the opposite sex walking down the street, our first thought is kind of like to assume that they're boyfriend and girlfriend or like stuff like that, right? That like just makes heterosexuality kind of like the norm. Right. And anyway, I don't want to like go too much on a tangent. So those are just some definitions. So here I remember talking about machismo and kind of like how just like racism or even queerphobia, like how a lot of people, when they think about things like this, like for example, like machismo, they think about kind of like big things. So, and also content warning, I'm going to just like mention, not like go into detail, but just like mention things like domestic abuse and sexual assault and stuff like that. Like right now, for example, what I'm getting at is that when people think about misogyny or machismo, they think more like domestic abuse as it pertains to, well, domestic abuse. Y'all know what that means. I don't want to get too much into it, right? Just for the sake of anybody watching this video. So that's mostly what people think about when they think about machismo. It's these like big things, right? Like, for example, like I guess the term would be like macroaggressions instead of like microaggressions, which we're going to talk about in a second. So like just another example, like when people think of racism, they think about someone calling someone else a slur, right? They don't think about microaggressions as they pertain to racism, like maybe being a person of color and walking into Macy's or like a store like that and being followed by security, which is something that a lot of us have gone through and have experienced, which is a form of racism, right? Because security at stores notoriously target people of color. So similarly with machismo, a lot of people don't think about quote unquote microaggressions, like everyday interactions. They don't consider it machismo. And that's kind of like what I'm trying to get at when I talk about machismo in Mexican culture, which is like a lot of things that are at first glance, they seem like they're traditions or they're like things from Mexican culture, really aren't. They're actually just machismo. Like that's what I'm talking about. Like, for example, like for me, I know growing up in a Mexican household and going to Mexican parties, right? I would always see my tias, my own mother, right? My grandmother serving their husbands a plate of food. And now, as I've gotten older, as I've started dating, as I've gone to family functions and family parties with my own partner, who happens to be a cisgender heterosexual male, I have experienced that too, where I'll show up to a party and one of the first things that they will tell me is, oh, did he already eat already? Or, oh, go get him a plate of food. When it's like, hi, hello, nice to see you. I'm also here. Are you also going to ask me if I already ate? Who's going to fix me my plate of food? Right. But these are things that like I said, I grew up seeing, and now I'm kind of experiencing too. And oftentimes that's just like, oh, that's just how it is. That's just how Mexican families are. Like, that's just, again, writing it off as kind of like some part or some aspect of Mexican culture or Mexican tradition, which is, if you're at a family gathering, you go fix your partner, your boyfriend or your husband a plate of food. That's your role, right? Instead of enjoying the party or just like eating yourself, you kind of have to be on the lookout whether, oh, did he already eat? Like, does he need another soda? Does he need this? Like, can I go get him another plate? Like, it's like this expectation again, right? Like that machismo, that misogyny that these patriarchal ideologies have instilled, where you're expected to do that. You're expected to get your boyfriend a plate of food. You're expected to get your husband a plate of food, whatever. So that's just a little example of what machismo looks like to me. It would be great if someone else was in here so that we can get like a lot of different perspectives or other ideas. But, you can just pause or take a moment to kind of think about what machismo looks like, sounds like, and feels like to you. So machismo affects and effects us all, right? And so machismo is something that not only affects women, especially not only women in Mexican culture, it is something that also affects men, and particularly it affects queer men as well. It really obviously affects trans women as well, right? Because again, machismo dictates like these expectations, these gendered expectations, these expectations that have to do with your gender and how you perform your gender, the things that you do based on your perceived gender, right? Which is just so often like, oh, so binary, like boy, girl, whatever. There are rules, I guess, that we have to follow. And a lot of these rules kind of like in Mexican culture, for example, like the rule that like men have to be manly, like masculine, right? Like you picture Mexican culture and you picture Mexican men and you think about like the charros. Like you think about like hard workers, right? Like the man like going out and doing like manual labor and being like the breadwinner of the house and stuff like that. So these are expectations of Mexican men essentially, or with like women, right? Like the expectation, like I said, of being at a family function and making sure like essentially being a caregiver or something to your partner, to your husband, to your boyfriend, or these expectations as well of queer men and how to perform their gender. Like, oh, you can't talk a certain way, you can't use certain slang, like you can't like dress a certain way. Like again, these expectations that affect us because they affect how we live our lives and the choices that we make or don't make. And they also affect the way that we relate to other people, right? So I know for a fact that a lot of the things that I went through when I was growing up, they really shaped how I related to partners and relationships, right? Even like as bisexual, pansexual, a woman growing up in a Mexican household. It affected how, well, it's because I don't like to talk about my personal stuff, but I guess I will because no one else is in here. But growing up queer essentially in a Mexican household, it meant for me that, again, misogyny, because these gendered expectations of me was that, you know, I was going to grow up and I was going to get married to a man and be a housewife or like a wife or whatever and have children or whatever. So I always hid when I would be, if I would be dating someone who was not a man. You know, to this day, I'm not out, I guess you could say, to my family, because I just don't want to deal with that. I just don't want to deal with it. And like I said, it made me hide a lot of my relationships, a lot of who I was, I guess. Like I had to hide a part of who I was or who I am to my family. And it affected relationships because a lot of the relationships I had with people who were not men didn't go any farther than they didn't go far because they couldn't go far, because I couldn't take them to parties or to family gatherings and stuff like that as anything else than like, oh, my friend, this is my friend. And it just it affected relationships and, like, you know, how I related to partners and potential partners and stuff like that. And again, this is like a spot where I would ask other people to share their experiences and how machismo has affected or affected them. Actually, here is where I would ask, how has machismo affected you, your family, your mother, your father, your partner? So this is kind of like where we take a moment to be reflective and think about how machismo affects everyone essentially, especially coming from a Mexican background, right? I know that as far as my father, it has affected him in that he's like almost 60 years old and he cannot express himself. He cannot express like his emotions. He always feels like he has to be stoic, and this has led to him just holding on to things inside of him until they explode. And that's something that I also can relate to. And I know that it's because of his expectations of being a man, right? Being like a macho, that you can't talk about your feelings, you can't cry, like you can't be depressed, like you have to just be the breadwinner, you have to go out and earn money and feed your family or whatever. My mother as well, like I know that's really affected her in many ways. Having been married at 19, having me at 20, living in a strange country away from any family members and having to live with my dad's family from an early age, and being expected to be a good daughter-in-law and a good mother and a good wife, and always being under the watchful eye of my dad's family, who they were not shy to talk their mess to her, right, and let her know when she was not doing something correctly. But anyway, I don't want to get into that because that's a lot. That's a lot to unpack. So it's not tradition, it's misogyny, right? Es machismo, no es tradición. Again, a lot of these things that we think about, a lot of these things that we went through, a lot of these things that we saw our family members going through, that we chalked it up, like we normalized it, like, oh, that's just how things are. And like, not really, you know, for example, like women doing all house chores, like that's just not how things are. Like, you know, in Mexican culture, that's not just, oh, that's just Mexican women. Like they love to clean. Like who likes to wash dishes? I mean, I guess there are people out there that like to do that, but it's like more so than anything, it's something that's imposed on you because again, it's an expectation of your gender. It's like a thing that you have to do because someone said that you look like this or you are this gender or this perceived gender, so you have to do this, right? Or again, getting your boyfriend a plate at the party, like that's, oh, that's like Mexican tradition, like that's what everyone does. No, that's just machismo. Like he can get his own plate. Like homie's an adult. He, you know, he's very capable of grabbing his food by himself. Or even the thing where like they tell boys, aguántese como los machos, like, you know, eres un macho, eres un hombre, like men don't cry, stuff like that. Like these things that are imposed on kids even from a young age. Things that I have heard having worked at a daycare too, or even being like the man of the house, right? Like that responsibility that you are like the leader or whatever of the house and you have to take care of everyone and you have to like everyone has to follow your lead, which is a huge responsibility in and of itself for men or for whoever it's imposed on, which usually it's men. So all of this to say that el machismo duele, daña, oprime, mata. Misogyny hurts, harms, oppresses, kills, because some people might kind of like be like, oh, you know, what's the big deal? You know, like what's the big deal of like fixing your boyfriend a plate at the family function, right? Like, oh, what's the big deal? Like that it's up to like the women all the time to raise the kids. Like, well, the thing is that these things have consequences. And a lot of the consequences are deadly and harmful. Mexico has a femicide problem. So I believe that the statistic is that every single day around a dozen women in Mexico are murdered or kidnapped or go missing or are assaulted or otherwise harmed physically or emotionally in Mexico. And a lot of this has to do with these expectations that I'm talking about. Because the thing is that if you don't conform to these expectations or if you don't meet these expectations, there are very real consequences. And a lot of the time, these consequences mean death or physical or emotional violence. A lot of the women that have been killed, especially in Mexico, have been killed by their partners and have been killed by their partners because their partner went into a fit of rage or because their partner was angry or jealous or because, you know, you have these expectations of being a good wife, right? So then what does a good wife do? She keeps the house clean. She keeps the kids in line. She cooks dinner. So then that quickly escalates to like, oh, you burnt my food. Why are the kids crying? Why is the house unclean or unkempt? And then from there, a lot of these men feel justified then. It's like, oh, she broke the rules. She didn't meet her expectations. So therefore, she's going to have to suffer these consequences. And the same thing goes with a lot of queer folks, especially in Mexican culture. It's all fun and games, right? Like I grew up watching Univision, telenovelas, and I forget the other news channel other than Univision, but it's like the same thing essentially. And a lot of like the TV shows, like the comedy sketch TV shows, it was a lot of homophobic jokes. It was a lot of gay jokes growing up, like a bunch. Um, and to some people, oh, it's just a joke. It's just, that's just like Mexican culture, like whatever. Like, because a lot of people like to say that, oh, Mexican culture is very dark humor or whatever. Yeah, okay. But again, a lot of these things have real world consequences, because then that translates to the excessive amount of queerphobic violence in Mexico. And that comes from like Mexican families, even to their own children. Um, so that's why misogyny hurts, harms, oppresses, and kills. These aren't just jokes. These aren't just benign traditions, or this isn't just a part of Mexican culture. It's all things that have real world consequences, and oftentimes the consequences are physical and or emotional violence. So the last slide here is Matando al Machismo and how to end the cycle. And some of this comes from setting boundaries, especially with your family, which I know is a very hard thing to do, especially in Mexican culture, because a lot of Mexican families have zero boundaries, zero, like none. There are no boundaries in Mexican families. And a lot of it also will come from talking to family and friends, especially talking to family. But I also know that it is very hard to have these conversations, especially in Mexican family households, because you will get a lot of pushback. And I know that from experience. But at the end of the day, it's just up to, I guess, the individual. It's up to you to kind of assess if it's worth it or not to like come into these conversations with your family, because I know that a lot of these turn into conflict and confrontations. And I know that at least for myself, I'm older now. So at 31, at my big age, I really don't care what my family thinks about me anymore. When I was younger, I did. When I was younger, especially because I lived in their house, right? I kind of had to rely on them for shelter and for food. And now that I'm older, well, I kind of still do, because the US is a hellhole, and we all essentially live in poverty. But I have a little more freedom. I'm at school now, like whatever. So I find myself that I don't really have to take a lot of their BS anymore. Or just, again, like I said, at my big age, being 31, like I really don't care anymore to have these conflicts with family, because I guess as I get older, I see them more kind of as equals. Because, especially like in Mexican household, like there's this really big thing about respecting your elders, which oftentimes just basically doesn't even mean respect, because respect goes both ways. By what they mean by that is obey me without questioning my authority. That's what they mean actually by saying respect to your elders. So when you're younger, you kind of like live in this, I don't want to say fear, but like kind of you like live in this kind of like, oh, that's my elder, like I have to respect them, which again translates to I have to obey them. I cannot question them. But now that I'm older, it's like, hey, we're all adults here. So we're going to have these adult conversations now. And you're going to take me as an adult because I am an adult, and I'm going to speak up now. So it really just comes, it's just really up to you, I guess, up to the individual. And I know it's hard. And if folks like would like some advice or just kind of like to vent, I'm here. I've gone through it. I'm still going through it. Like, believe me. my family doesn't even invite me to like family get-togethers anymore because they know how I am. So like I get it. You know, I've been through a lot of things coming from a Mexican household and then dating a cisgender heterosexual Mexican man as well. So that's been fun. So if anybody wants to kind of like talk about that stuff and setting boundaries and really kind of like just putting limits between you and other people, especially when it comes to family members and stuff like that, like I have experience. I have experience, okay? Um, but yeah, that was essentially it. I hope this made sense. Basically, it's just that we have to really start like taking a critical look into a lot of the things that we normalize, especially within Mexican households. And we have to start asking why we normalize these things and who these things can harm and how they can harm people and whether or not we should change them. And the answer to that last question is 99% of the time, yes, we should change them. But yeah, better late than never, I guess. I hope y'all enjoyed this, and hopefully I will post more videos like this soon.